We hope and we pray that everyone is doing well, inshallah ta'ala, tonight. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes us among those who learn beneficial knowledge and apply what they learn in their life, and that the knowledge is an excuse for us and not against us, Ya Rabbil Alameen. To proceed, so tonight we are doing our top 50 hadith that every Muslim should know, and we are on tonight hadith number 2. So we only have one left after this. However, because hadith number 2 is a very long hadith, we will not finish it tonight. And inshallah ta'ala, I don't want to take too much time because I'm still feeling under the weather. We'll mention the hadith and we'll probably only get through the first maybe 2 points. And then we'll continue inshallah ta'ala with the hadith. We should wrap it up next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. This hadith is a hadith that everyone should know. In fact, many scholars have said about this hadith that its importance is such that if no, he's okay. Yeah. Just to the right or to the left, يعني 2 feet. أيوة, right here. أيوة, خلاص. They said that there is not a chapter or a topic of Islam that is not derived from this hadith. And if a person makes that claim, they are lying. This is what one of the scholars he says. يعني هذا الحديث يدخل فيه جميع أبواب الدين. Every chapter, every topic has an origin in this hadith. This is why it's so important. Obviously, so here's the thing. Taking 2 weeks on this hadith arguably is not enough. We're just going to cover the main, obviously, issues and some of the pertinent things that would apply to us. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I remember there was one scholar, he did a series, an Egyptian scholar, he did a series on this hadith and it took him 60 lectures. 60 lectures, he's breaking down, obviously what he did, yani I'll explain what he did once we say the hadith. But 60, and even when he was done, he was like, and there's much that we have left out. And I'm like, are you serious? And I listened to it. So Allah musta'an. With that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll begin. This hadith is narrated in the books by Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu anhu. So obviously Umar radiyallahu anhu has a lot of hadith, especially hadith number 1 is him, hadith number 2 is him, hadith number 3 is his son Abdullah ibn Umar. In fact, this one technically is narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar. And we'll mention why. But he says that Umar radiallahu anhu is the one who says. So he says what? And it's known as the hadith of Gabriel, right? It says, بينما نحن جلوس عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ذات يوم إذ طلع علينا رجل شديد بياض الثياب شديد سواد الشعر لا يرى عليه أثر السفر ولا يعرف أحد منا حتى جلس إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فأسند ركبتيه إلى ركبتيه ووضع كفيه على فخذيه وقال يا محمد أخبرني عن الإسلام. So he says that Umar, of course, is the narrator. He says that one day we were sitting in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and a man who had extremely white clothes, extremely black hair, no signs of travel can be seen upon this man, but no one knows him until he sits down in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So he puts his knees against his knees and he puts his hands upon his thighs, meaning he's sitting himself like this, and says, "O Muhammad." Some scholars have said that he's putting his hands on the thighs of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's a long discussion on this. We don't need to get into that one. وقال يا محمد, he says, "O Muhammad, tell me what is Islam." أخبرني ما الإسلام. طيب. Of course, we've heard this hadith before. We'll just finish the hadith, and we'll talk about why was this hadith narrated to begin with, which is very relevant to our discussion, I believe. طيب. He says, Al-Islamu, the Prophet ﷺ, in this narration. Now, this narration that we're mentioning, that the one that everybody knows is in Sahih Muslim. There are other versions in Bukhari that actually differ in the wording. In fact, some narrations that are also authentic in the Tirmidhi and others, he says the first thing that he asks about is not Islam, but he asks about iman. So we have the order typically that we go is that it's Islam, iman, and then ihsan. But there are authentic narrations that actually put iman, and then Islam, and then ihsan. And some narrations actually say Islam, ihsan, and then iman. All of these are authentic. The most, and the one that is critical for us, is this one that everybody knows. I'm mentioning this just so that people know and are aware that the order is not necessarily set in stone. Yet the order that we have it here is very important for us as well, inshaAllah ta'ala. طيب. So he asks about al-Islam. In some of the narrations, he says, Al-Islam an tashhad an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. That you bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides Allah, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger of Allah. In some of the narrations, it actually says, an al-Islamu an ta'bud Allah la tushriku bihi shay'a. That you worship Allah and do not associate partners with Him. Okay? So it doesn't say the Shahada. That version is in At-Tirmidhi and some of the others. I'm mentioning this, why? Because these narrations happen, obviously, it's a human endeavor. Obviously they mean practically the same thing. So you shouldn't get too picky on the wording, because obviously they're meaning the same thing. And the one where he says, أخبرني ما الإيمان, he says, أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته, etc. So he says, الإسلام أن تشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ومحمد رسول الله وتقيم الصلاة وتؤتي الزكاة وتصوم رمضان وتحج البيت إن استطعت إليه سبيلا. قال صدقت. He says, so obviously he tells him the 5 pillars of Islam. That you bear witness, the testimony of faith, that you pray, you establish a prayer, that you pay your zakah, you fast Ramadan, and you make hajj if you find a way to do so. And then he says, صدقت, you are truthful, you're correct. So Umar radiallahu anhu, he comments and he says, فعجبنا له يسأله ويصدقه. He's asking him, but then he's also saying, hey, you're correct. You know what I mean? This is an oddity here that's added, because they don't know who this person is. Then he says, فأخبرني عن الإيمان. Tell me about iman. قال أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر وتؤمن بالقدر خيره وشره. He says, tell me about iman, about faith. He says that you believe in Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, the last day, and that you believe in qadr, in destiny. It's good and it's bad. قال صدقت. He says, yes, you are truthful. قال فأخبرني عن الإحسان. Tell me about ihsan. He says, that is that you worship Allah and تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. That is that you worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, then He sees you. Then he says, قال فأخبرني عن الساعة. Then he says, tell me about the hour. قال ما المسؤول عنها بأعلم من السائل. That the one who is being asked is not more knowledgeable than the one who is asking. قال فأخبرني عن أماراتها. Then tell me about its signs. قال أن تلد الأمة ربتها. Tell me about its signs. He says that the amma, that the slave girl, will give birth to its master or her master. وأن ترى الحفاة العراة العالة رعاء الشاء يتطاولون في البنيان. And that you see the barefooted, naked, poor shepherds competing to build tall buildings. ثم انطلق. Then after this he left. فلبثت مليا. He says, then a period of time passes, and then the Prophet ﷺ tells me, يا عمر أتدري من السائل? Oh Umar, do you know who that questioner was? قلت الله ورسوله أعلم. He says, Allah and His Messenger know best. قال فإنه جبريل أتاكم يعلمكم دينكم. That was Jibreel. He came to teach you your religion. This is the narration of Imam Muslim rahimahullah. طيب. It is said that this hadith was very close. It was narrated very close to the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of time. Why? Because now it's time to summarize the whole message. Now we're getting a picture of what it is that this religion is all about. And like I said, there's not a chapter of knowledge, there's not a single thing about Islam that couldn't be added into one of these things. In another narration that Imam Muslim has in his book, remember, so a lot of these books of ahadith, they narrate multiple ahadith in different sections of their books. So Imam Muslim narrates the same hadith. In it, there are some additions. What are they? When he added about Islam, when he was asked about Islam, he said, Al-Islamu, and then he mentioned what it is, and then he says, وَتَحُجْ وَتَعْتَمِرْ وَتَغْتَسِلُ مِنَ الْجَنَابَةِ وَتُتِمُّ الْوُضُوءِ. He says that part of Islam is that you make hajj, and you make umrah, and that you make ghusl from the janaba, and that you perfect your wudu. Then the questioner, in this version of Imam Muslim, the questioner says, فَإِذَا فَعَلْتُ ذَلِكَ فَأَنَا Muslim. If I do this, then I am a Muslim. And he says, قَالَ نَعَمْ. He says, yes. And then in Al-Iman, he says, وَتُؤْمِن. So he adds, on top of what we just mentioned, in Iman, when he is asked about faith, he adds the following, وَتُؤْمِنَ بِالْجَنَّةِ وَالنَّارِ وَالْمِيزَانِ. That you believe in paradise and the hellfire, and that you believe in the mizan, the scale, the deeds or the people will be weighed on the Day of Judgment. Then he asks in this one, فَإِذَا فَعَلْتُ ذَلِكَ فَأَنَا مُؤْمِنٌ. If I do this, then I am a believer. قَالَ نَعَمْ. And then at the end of it, he says, in this narration in Imam Muslim, he says, this was Jibreel, he came to teach you your religion, your deen. خُذُوا عَنْهُ, take this. وَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ. He says, by him whose hand is in his hand is my soul. ما شُبِّهَ عَلَيَّ منذ أتاني قبل مرتي هذه وما عرفته حتى ولى. He says, I have never not known Jibreel, that it was him when he came to me, except this time. And I only realized that it was Jibreel once he left. And this is the Prophet ﷺ saying this. So in this version, it says that the Prophet ﷺ did not know who he was. Now in the original version that all of us know, it seems to be the case that the Prophet ﷺ actually knew who he was. Right? It seems to be the case. There's nothing explicit. Yeah, in this version, it's not that. طيب, in the version, there's a third version. So this is the second version of Imam Muslim. The third version that's actually an agreed upon version, that's in both Bukhari and Muslim, this one starts with, what is iman, not Islam. So in the agreed upon, it actually starts with iman, and the rest is the same. It's just the order is a little bit different. Okay? In that one, he also adds at the very end that of the signs of the Day of Judgment. After this, the Prophet ﷺ recites the last verse of Surah Luqman, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ عِنْدَهُ عِلْمُ السَّاعَةِ وَيُنَزِّلُ الْغَيْثَ وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْأَرْحَامِ وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ مَاذَا تَكْسِبُ غَدًا وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ بَأَيِّ أَرْضٍ تَمُوتُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. And in this version, he adds that there are certain things that only Allah knows. Indeed, Allah has knowledge of the hour, and He sends down the rain, and He knows what is in the wombs. And no soul knows what it will earn tomorrow, and no soul knows in which land it will die. Indeed, Allah is all knowledgeable, all acquainted. Then he says that the man left, and the Prophet ﷺ called for the man. He says, bring back the man, and they went out and they couldn't find anybody. And then at this, the Prophet ﷺ tells them that was Jibreel. طيب. All of this said, like we said, there's multiple versions. There's a lot to be said about this hadith. First things first, what was the occasion for narrating this hadith? Does anybody know? له مناسبة. So obviously the incident happened, but why was it narrated? It was narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma in the narration of the Sahih. However, other companions actually narrate it as well. So there were other companions there who saw this incident. Other than Umar. Obviously the sanad that goes back to Umar is the most authentic. We have narrations that go back to Anas. We have narrations that go back to Ibn Abbas and others, but they're not as authentic as this one. It goes back to Ibn Umar. And the incident was that the incident of Ma'bad al-Juhani. So Ma'bad al-Juhani was a man in early Islam. This is during the time when some of the companions are still alive. This is roughly before the year 80 Hijrah. Before. So this is around maybe 70s, in the 70 Hijrah, 70s, that decade, roughly. Ma'bad al-Juhani. So in the narration, and this is, by the way, this incident, the whole incident preceding the narration of the hadith is also in Sahih Muslim. So that's how we know what it is. But usually people don't know the beginning part. We just narrate the part where Jibreel enters the masjid. So it says, كان أول من تكلم في القدر أول من قال في القدر بالبصرة معبد الجهني. So his name is Ma'bad al-Juhani. And there's a lot of things on him, especially when it comes to theological issues, where he was getting his information, this individual. There's some reason. We don't know that much about him. We know a lot about him from his opponents, but not from him himself. He claimed to be Muslim, obviously. Sheikh Yasir al-Qadi, part of his research was on this individual and his student, who's Jahm, and the issues that surrounded these guys. Okay? So we'll mention why these people are important. So he started talking about qadar, right? The issue of predestination, which, by the way, is a very difficult issue to talk about regardless. The issue of predestination. This issue of predestination has led to arguably one of the first schisms in Islam. Schisms in Islam, right? theological schisms, not political. Political schisms were happening before. They did not lead to theology, right? This is the first theological, one of the first theological, because the first theological, everybody should know this, the first theological schism in Islam happened at the hands of the Khawarij, right? Where they differed on what makes a believer and what makes a Muslim, which is actually what we're talking about now. So it's actually relevant to our discussion. To define what is a Muslim and to define what is a mu'min is very important. Why? Because confusion about this led the Khawarij to do what they did, where they believed, and we'll mention what they did. What they believed is, and this is the first schism, theological in Islam, which is where they said that a person who commits a sin is no longer a believer. And if he's no longer a believer, he's no longer a Muslim. And see, this hadith differentiates between Islam and iman, right? And this is why it's so important, because even if a person has sins and shortcomings and whatever, he's still a Muslim. We cannot expel him out of the fold of Islam. Maybe he's not a mu'min, and this is why there's a verse that actually confirms this in Surah Al-Hujurat, يَمُنُّونَ عَلَيْكَ أَنْ أَسْلَمُوا قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا لكن قولوا أسلمنا. This is يمنون is at the very end, but also it confers another idea. But it says قالت الأعراب آمنا. The Arab, they said what? We believe. We are believers. آمنا. They use the word. قل لم تؤمنوا. Say no, you haven't believed. ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. Rather say we have accepted Islam. ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم. Right? Then when iman enters your heart, after iman enters your heart, then at this point you can say that you're believers. But at this point you're just Muslims, which tells us that the first step is Islam. This is why the version of Imam Muslim is the one that we take, because it's confirmed by the verse. First step is Islam, and then after this is belief. So when these people said, no, he can't be a believer. By the way, they're not, the Khawarij, part of the fitna is that they're not completely wrong. Why? There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, لا يزني الزاني حين يزني وهو مؤمن ولا يسرق السارق حين يسرق وهو مؤمن. He says that the person who commits zina, the adulterer, is not a mu'min in the instance when he commits that sin. And that the thief, in the moment when he commits the sin, he's not a mu'min either. Why is the Prophet ﷺ saying this? He's actually negating iman from them, but not Islam. And they misunderstood this idea. And they said, no, these people are not Muslims to begin with. Therefore, they need to retake their shahada, number one. And they asked actually many companions to do this. And in fact, this is what led them to kill one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and start their whole fitna. And then because they said, if he's not a believer, then his blood is halal. Therefore we can kill him, and they killed him. And on the same day, after they just killed the companion and they killed his wife who was pregnant, one of them killed a pig that they saw that was owned by a Christian farmer. And then they said, la, you cannot do this. You have to give him money instead of the pig that you just killed, because this wasn't our property, blah, 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 blah. And they're strict in such a degree that they have because they're interpreting the rules on their own, which is why obviously we can't do this. Meaning interpret just on our own. طيب. So the Khawarij were the first people, and like I said, it was because they misunderstood this very hadith. And this is why this hadith is so important. Understanding these different levels, that a person can be a Muslim but not necessarily a mu'min, right? And so on. طيب. So this was the first schism in Islam. In terms of theological schisms, especially on the topic of qadar, was these people who spoke about qadar in al-Basra, and this happened, by the way, other places as well. Why this happened? Some of the research, this is modern research, by the way, and in fact some classical scholars said this, is that a lot of these people were either Christian converts, or they themselves learned a lot of the religion at the hands of Christian converts, who had these ideas now very well established in Christianity. When it comes to the issue of qadar, when it comes to the issue of destiny, what do Christians believe? Do they believe in destiny? Or the different levels of destiny? When we say destiny, by the way, there's different levels. And so some Christians affirm some levels and some negate some levels. So the level of knowledge, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything and He knows the destiny. Most believers in any religion believe in this, because negating this negates one of the core attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you almost cannot be a believer unless you affirm this. Does that make sense? I hope this step is understood. This is a little deeper theological, but it's important. However, the next steps are where people differ. Like after Allah knows, He writes. Did Allah write everything? Some Christians negate this. Right? Because if He wrote it, that means it's set in stone. Your destiny cannot change, which means you're bound by it. And for many Christians, I've had discussions myself with Christian pastors, with people who are ingrained in their field, and their schisms, by the way, right now, these Christian groups that you have, the different denominations, some of the core issues that they differ on is actually with regards to the issue of qadar. Most lay Christians have no idea about this discussion. They don't know this. What makes a Methodist, and a Baptist, and an Episcopalian, is primarily due to their belief in qadar, their belief in predestination. And yet the lay people, if you ask them, why do you go to this one? Their answer is what? It's the closest. Oh, my friends go here. I like this one because they don't stand as much, or this one, the pastor's short. And it has nothing to do with qadar for the lay person. Even for the clergy now, when you talk to them about these issues, many of them actually make mistakes. Like I had a discussion with some of them, and they're like, yeah, actually, so in our denomination this, but it never really made sense to me. You can tell he's Aslan doesn't even agree with his own denomination. He's employed, he's going along with the flow, وهكذا. Why am I saying all of this? We had in early Islam, because these issues hadn't been fleshed out yet, many early Muslims were influenced by carryover aqidas from previous religions. Right? This is a well-known fact. Even early scholars talked about this. Obviously, this is why it was so important to propagate what proper belief in these things is. This is why this hadith is so important. So Ma'bad al-Juhani is not negating qadar necessarily from the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What he's negating is that everything is set in stone, you have no free will, etc. He's saying that you're writing it as you go. It's being written as you go. This is what he said. وَأَنَا الْأَمْرَ أُنُوفٌ. Okay? So, the narrator of the hadith is the one who tells us the story. So he's Yahya ibn Ya'mar. He says, فَانْطَلَقْتُ أَنَا وَحُمَيْدُ بْنُ عَبْدُ الرَّحْمَنِ الْحِمْيَرِ حَاجِّينَ أَوْ مُعْتَمِرِينَ. Says, we went, me and my friend, Humayd ibn Abdul Rahman. We went to Hajj or to Umrah. And we said, if we found one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ to ask him about what these people are saying about qadar. So it tells us that Ma'bad al-Juhani wasn't alone. There were people who had the same ideas with him. And remember, these are old holdover ideas from previous religions that people have converted from. And that they're having to contend with. They don't know what to do. They said, let's go ask, by the way, their method here is a very good method. Let's do what? Let's go ask one of the companions. One of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they can tell us what's going on. طيب. He says, فَوُفِّقَ لَنَا عَبْدُ اللَّهِ بْنُ عُمَرْ ibn al-Khattab رضي الله عنهما. We came to Abdullah ibn Umar. And he was coming into the masjid. So we went, one of us to the right, one of us to the left. And I thought my friend would let me talk. So I talked. Said, Ya Aba Abdul Rahman. This is his kunya for Abdullah ibn Umar. He says, people have appeared in our midst. They are reading Quran. They seek knowledge. They're doing these things. However, what they say, they're saying something that sounds blasphemous to us, which is they claim that there's no qadar, there's no destiny, and that the whole affair is unuf, meaning it's just haphazard. It's being written as we go. قال Abdullah ibn Umar. Now, here we have to remember, Abdullah ibn Umar he's one of the strictest companions, but it's a good strictness. It's a strictness that's sometimes needed. That's why when you hear what he says, might sound very tough, but in fact, like I said, sometimes toughness is needed. He says, فَإِذَا لَقِيتَ أُولَٰئِكَ. If you meet these people, فَأَخْبِرْهُمْ. Then tell them, أَنِّي بَرِيءٌ مِّنْهُمْ. Tell them that I am innocent of them. I have nothing to do with them. وَأَنَّهُمْ بُرَاءٌ مِّنِّي. And that they are innocent of me. وَالَّذِي يَحْلِفُ بِهِ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ بْنُ عُمَرٍ. And by that in which Abdullah ibn Umar swears, meaning he's swearing by Allah, but he's making an emphasis on how important this is. لو أن لأحدهم مثل أحد ذهبا فأنفقه ما قبل الله منه حتى يؤمن بالقدر. If one of them had similar an amount of wealth to the mountain of Uhud in gold and he were to give it away, Allah will not accept from him until he believes in qadar, until he believes in destiny. And then he says, ثم قال, and then Abdullah ibn Umar says, my father told me, who is Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, that one day he was sitting in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and then he continues the hadith as we know it. Now why does he mention the whole hadith? To tell them that the Prophet ﷺ, in that hadith where he's summarizing the entire religion, he made a part of iman the belief in predestination. We have to believe in it. Like we said, the belief in predestination is important. In terms of what do we believe in as Muslims? We believe that it has levels, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge, He knows, then He writes, then He wills it into being, and then He creates it. And a lot of these people might negate the creation of it. They say, what? Allah creates it? Even if I do something bad? Is that part of Allah's creation? Yes, it can't escape Allah's creation. Which might seem blasphemous to some people, but this is the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's important to differentiate between al-mashi'a al-qadariyya, al-mashi'a al-kawniyya, and al-mashi'a al-shar'iyya. Allah's will in terms of predestination, and Allah's will in terms of what His legislation is, what He wants for you to do, and what He allows to do as part of His creation. طيب. So the purpose of the hadith was to establish the importance of qadar, which we know is a part of iman. Like we said, in some of the versions, iman is mentioned first. And it could be possible that iman is mentioned first in order to emphasize the issue of qadar. But we know that Islam comes first, as the ayah says, and then iman comes, and then ihsan. Obviously, Islam is a larger circle. It encompasses more issues of our religion than does iman. Iman is more specific to the heart. A person might say tayyib. It seems to be and we'll answer this question and then we'll end here inshallah ta'ala, just because I don't want to take too much time. Iman, all of the issues of iman that he mentioned are not actions. Right? It says belief in Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, the last day, and al-qadar. Tayyib. Those are not actions. Are actions part of iman? Yes, they are. In fact, this is a very well established position of Ahlus Sunnah al-Jama'ah, is that al-imanu qawlun wa amal yazid wa yanqus. Iman is a statement and it is an action, and it increases and decreases. Tayyib. If here in the hadith he doesn't mention any of the deeds, and that the deeds seem to be under Islam, what do we do about iman? You know what I mean? Is this a proof that iman is not contingent on actions? No. There's other proofs. In fact, there's many proofs that iman is contingent on actions, where the Prophet ﷺ, he says, Al-imanu bid'un wa sittuna wa fi riwaya bid'un wa sab'una shu'ba. That iman itself is 60 odd branches, and another narration says 70 odd branches. The highest of which is what? La ilaha illallah. And the lowest of which is what? Imatatul adha an at-tariq. Right, removal of harm from the path. And that's an action. وَالْحَيَاءُ شُعْبَةٌ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ. And modesty, or having that sense of shame, is a branch of iman. There's a lot of other ahadith. In fact, we can mention, there's that when he was asked about iman, he says that you do this, that you do this. Right? Meaning he's basing it on actions. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Every time he says, "O you who have believed," and then there's an action. Why? He's making it contingent that action makes them believers. And this is why these are some of the proofs that actually mention that iman is contingent on our actions, yes. But here iman is meant these theological, these beliefs. Right? Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, he was asked, and inshallah ta'ala we'll end with this. Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah was asked, "Amu'minun ant? Are you a believer?" He said, if you ask me, إذا كنت تسألني, if I believe in Allah and His angels and His books and His messengers and the last day and al-qadar, it's good and it's bad, فأنا مؤمن بذلك. I am a believer in this. However, ولكن, if you're asking me about المؤمنون الذين ذكرهم الله في كتابه, about the believers that Allah has mentioned in His book, إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وإذا تلت عليهم آياته زادتهم إيمانا وعلى ربهم يتوكلون فأنا لست من هؤلاء. Okay, he says, if you're asking me if I am one of the believers whom Allah describes in His book that the believers, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, the believers are only those who, and then he describes three characteristics. He says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجَلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, the one whom, when Allah is remembered, their hearts tremble. وَإِذَا تُلَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا, and when the verses are recited upon them, it increases them in their iman. وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ, and upon their Lord they rely. Then I cannot say I'm from one of those. I'm not from one of those. And he was obviously being humble, right? We know who Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah is. By the way, the verses continue, which is proof that iman is contingent on actions, because it says, الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ. Says the ones who establish their prayer. The next verse says the ones who establish their prayer and give their zakat, which obviously makes it contingent upon iman, that you can't be a mu'min unless you're actually doing those actions as well. And because it's a concentric circle, that means that I can't be a mu'min unless I'm doing everything of the actions of Islam. I mean, I can't start with iman and then go backwards. No, I have to actually be doing the actions, and then after this I can start to build my iman. Regardless, the hadith of Hasan shows us that he differentiated between iman as a concept, which is what we would call aqidah these days. Back then they didn't have a word for it. They didn't call it that. The times of Al-Hasan meaning. And between iman as an actual thing in the heart of the believer that needs to be nurtured, needs to be grown, needs to be fed. That is that light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in the heart of every believer. And there are things that we can do, obviously, to nurture our iman, and we'll mention them. There's a whole list that I have here on how to actually increase our iman, inshaAllah ta'ala. With this said, does anybody have any questions? InshaAllah. Yeah, go ahead.
It's not about related to the hadith itself, I don't know. But there is terminology used commercialized. What does that specifically mean?
Establishing the prayer? Yeah. So iqam is salah, meaning iqam is to make something stand up, or to establish it, meaning it's something that has to be built. It's not just something that you perform, but it's something more than this. You're taking care of it, there's maintenance. So obviously that means you're taking care of it, you're perfecting it. It's not something that you're taking haphazardly, you're actually building it up, which entails you're doing the tahara for it, you're seeking out the qibla, you're seeking out the times, you're not taking it for granted. You know what I mean? When you pray, you make sure every single movement is correct, your mind is there, your heart is there. It's not just, I'm going to pray and go. And that's why it never mentions it in the verb form, it always mentions it in establishing form. So, no. And Allah knows best. No. Any other questions, inshallah? Yeah, tafaddal.
I read some scholars said that when Babu said that he believed,
No.
it was said no, he did not believe.
Yes.
They refer that because Islamic State was established,
Yeah.
and these people became the obedient to the laws of the state. So because salama means the obedience.
Yeah. They submit.
Yeah, they submitted because like in USA, you have to submit to the laws of the USA.
Sah.
But the iman has not entered.
No.
When so
100% now. Actually, some have said that some of them were hypocrites, but this opinion is weak because it says that they have submitted. You can't call them hypocrites. It would have called them out on their hypocrisy, but yeah, you're right. But that they have submitted to the laws, they have submitted to the authority, or said, we're here, we're at your will, so to speak. Yes, you're right. No. Okay. Barakallahu feekum, jazakallahu khairan, subhanakallah wa hamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. I hope it was well. Sheikh